Hey guys, we're here today going over the first ever BBL Draft League study. By the end of this mini-series on the channel, it'll be about 3 or 4 videos depending on how long each of these drafts take. We hope to end up finding a fundamental solution to just common draft league tiering issues. I'll get into that in a little bit, but of course, if you do enjoy the video today, leave a like below and subscribe for more content just like this. And comment your thoughts down below on just what happened, I guess, with the first round. Obviously, you know, there's going to be a lot of stuff that some people might not understand, and I'm going to try and break it down as easily as possible, but I do want to answer the fundamental question, of course, for anyone who might have stumbled across this video without actually knowing, what is a draft league? So for a draft league, of course, this consists of about 16 coaches typically, though sometimes they have 12, sometimes 8, sometimes they have even more than 16, but typically the number is 16, and typically they will go for about 10 to 12 Pokemon per team. Some just do a hard 11, some even just do as few as 8 Pokemon, but typically in any standard draft league, it's about 10 to 12. And you'll go through in a snake order for a randomized draft pick. It'll be pick 1, then 2, 3, 4, etc., all the way to pick 16. Then it goes 16, 15, 14, etc., all the way back to pick 1. And you'll keep going back and forth until everyone's completed their teams. Sometimes there'll be a budget, sometimes it'll just be free range. But typically, though, you will have a budget. So with this in mind, going into the BBL's specific draft league study, we did want to figure out a few different things. For one, we ended up expanding upon our ban list yet again. As we did last generation, at the end of the generation, we did unban every single Pokemon this time around in the Showdown Division. One of the things that we wanted to fix this time around was how to make the tier list less awful than the Season 3 one. And that's not to say it was really bad. It's really just hyperbole at that point. Honestly, it wasn't too terrible, but there was a few very fundamental flaws with it. One, the budget was way too slim considering the peak of Pokemon. For example, we had Pokemon pricing as high as 40 points, when at the same time we only had 110 points to draft, which meant that over a third of the points were being used to get some of the top tier Pokemon. If you look at any standard draft league, most end up doing about, at least for points draft leagues that is, they mostly do about 110 to 120 points, but their peaks typically end up being about 18 total. So it's a huge discrepancy, of course, in the top end of the pool. So with that in mind, of course, one of the things we wanted to fix was, in general, the budget scaling. We ended up proposing a 160 flat start, and this is so far, in my opinion, worked out pretty well. Budget for the top Pokemon will obviously increase as the study goes on, and I'll show that comparison in a bit later on. But at the very least, that was our starting round. It was 40 points for a top Pokemon, just because it's what we did in Season 3, and we thought it at least was a fine starting point. And then having a 160 as a budget instead. One of the other things we did want to fix, though, was making the drafts less linear. Because obviously, if you ask any draft league player, whether they've played an Uber's draft league or just even a standard draft league, there's definitely a hierarchy of picks typically assumed to go, at least for the first few rounds. For example, if I have first pick overall, typically I'm going to be getting Pokemon such as Dragapult or Shifu, or if they're banned, a Pokemon such as maybe Torrentee, Garchomp, etc. And then obviously you'll go through, and typically those first few picks are, for the most part, within like a certain range. Like for example, Dragapult will probably never fall below like pick 3 in a standard league if it's allowed. Torrentee will probably be in the first 5 or 6 picks. Garchomp will probably be in the top 8, etc., etc. And obviously, I mean, there's still different ranges for this. Like, for example, Garchomp probably will never be in the top 2 unless if stuff like Dragapult and Urshifu are banned, which in that case, maybe it will. But typically, though, it'll be in like a 3 to 8 range, for example. And there's a lot of nuance to this, obviously, because sometimes, of course, Pokemon are priced differently, and it makes some things more or less valuable because of that, because you'll save points or maybe be spending too much getting a certain Pokemon. But typically, though, there is, for the most part, a pretty unspoken hierarchy of picks. So one of the things we did want to fix, though, with this as well, is trying to make things a little bit more surprising. And I guess, with that in mind, also breaking apart just standard fundamental draft league cores, or just standard progression of a draft. This way, we can, of course, add value to Pokemon that might not necessarily see play. For example, Terrakion is a pretty rare pick in the upper tiers. You'll see it maybe go in about, like, 30 to 50% of the leagues at most. But typically, though, Draken is definitely one of those, like, less sought-after Pokemon. Same as stuff like Volcarona. It's one of those things you either plan to get it going into a draft, or you really just never get it past, like, around 2 or 3. Unless you know for a fact no one will get it. But typically, it's either in the round 2 or 3 or in the very last round range, if it goes at all. And there's definitely a handful of Pokemon that are just like that. And that's mostly just due to the fact that there are better options in their tiers. So we did want to make that at least a little bit more debatable. So going off of this for the first board, we did end up setting a few things. I'll go over some really key things that we did set. One of the big ones, for example, was not only making Zamazenta crowned a non-Uber, which, to be fair, the Ubers and not-Ubers is pretty meaningless for this board because we didn't actually restrict it to cores like we typically do. But one of the other things was we made Shaman Sky really cheap. Now, Shaman Sky is a Pokemon that I think has not went in BBL history since Sparks the God played in BBL, and it's because Sparks got it in pretty much every BBL run that he did. Otherwise, though, I can't really name any coaches off the top of my head that have done it, though I'm sure maybe one or two have. It's a very rare pick, though. And Zamazenta Crown is when I think all of once or twice in BBL history for Showdown, at least. It's one of those ones that kind of just has to go at some point where you're just not getting another Uber. But Zamazenta Crown was another mon we decided to cheapen. We also did, of course, scale some other stuff down. For example, we ended up scaling a lot of Arceus forms down a bit. Well, actually, we scaled them up more so. We scaled stuff like, for example, Ho-Oh up, because Ho-Oh was a mon that always ended up getting in like the top 3 or 4, and it's a really consistent performer, and especially since it's not like we have to, worry about different Ubers pairings to make this a justifiable pick, we decided to increase Ho-Oh's cost. And this was also seen with mons like Marshadow, Mewtwo, and Yveltal on the base tier list, just accounting for previous BBL history, because we did actually have that for more than just one season this generation. But we did kind of have to eye test it, at least for Pokemon like Zacian Crown and Mega Ray. Those were, in our opinion, the 2 clear cuts. Though you could definitely make a case for base form Arceus and Zacian regular form also being up there. We personally just felt Mega Ray and Zacian Crown, for the time being, were just in a league of their own. These, to put in perspective, that current 40-point tier is the Pokemon that we are very leaning ban on and just seeing how it goes through the study. And everything in 35 we thought at least was most likely going to be allowed, at least with 80% certainty. So with that said, how did the drafts actually go? So first thing I want to go over is the mons in general that went in terms of the frequency. So you do actually have a usage stat for this, and if you join the BBL server link down below, you can actually see this doc for yourself. But one of the few things that you will notice right away is these red numbers. So these red numbers were actually on staff error, and this came down to a total of 6 Pokemon, though this stock will only show 5 because one of them was actually fixed right before the board was made, being Conkeldurr was drafted twice in one of the pools. However, we did have some other outliers, stuff like Drapion and Vikavolt going twice in Pool A for Division 1. We had Entei and Rillaboom going twice in Pool 2B, and then over here, it's a little bit off to the side, but you can see, so if we unlock this really quickly, of course, and move it, you can see Nidoqueen at the very top right was also another Pokemon that was drafted multiple times. So obviously this was a user error, and this was something I did want to point out, of course, because this did potentially change some mons tiering. I more so, if I had to guess, would assume that this maybe bumped up Nidoqueen a point, if at all. Rillaboom, I'm assuming, was in 18 anyway, and we'll see why, of course, as we actually break through the drafts. Though these Pokemon are such a high frequency, I don't know how much it mattered. The one thing I do think that actually did matter a bit was Vikavolt. I will say the Vikavolt might have ended up getting a point raised because of this, considering it didn't go very often. But the fact that it went twice in one of these pools, I will say that might have actually raised it from like maybe being in 9 points versus being in 10 points, if at all. I can't really speak with certainty on that, obviously. The person who's doing the code on my behalf is Splurge, of course, one of the BBL admins, and he understands this far better than I could. I'm sure he could actually break down if it did or didn't end up mattering, but I more so just know the very bare bones of this. Ask him if you want any actual, like, thorough breakdown. Again, BBL server, great place to ask about that. But we can still, regardless of this, though, even with the small user error, which we did fix going to Cycles 2, and then the future cycles already accounted for, is going through and seeing how frequently some Pokemon were drafted. And if we look through, we can actually notice some pretty cool things. For example, this is sorted by ABC order, of course, not by point order. But specifically, though, obviously, if we look at the column, we see stuff like Mandibuzz and also stuff like Rotom Wash and Heat. All of these got drafted 6 times. But a couple other things that were a bit surprising was stuff like Scolipede going 6 times, which was pretty insane to me, to be honest. I really didn't even think Scolipede would get drafted 3 times, if I'm going to be honest. So seeing it go 6 times was definitely something that we didn't really expect. Some other things that were actually really surprising was Dragapult did not go unanimously. And this is a Pokemon that typically has an insane BBL track record, and I assume that mostly just the fact that it could scarf past a lot of these unbanned Pokemon and just go for stuff like a Draco Meteor or even just a Fire Blast and get some good damage off. I thought that would be pretty desirable at 18, but Dragapult ended up actually going in only 5 drafts, which I know doesn't really sound like a lot, but it was, in my opinion, a bit surprising. I thought it was going to be one of those Pokemon that went pretty unanimously, at least in this first pool. We can obviously go down. Another thing that went not unanimously that I was surprised about was Rayquaza. Now, Rayquaza, we'll actually see, did go extremely late in a few of these drafts, and that did actually lead to Rayquaza going down in points. But I'll get into that a little bit more later. Was just shocked that Rayquaza, again, didn't go unanimously. You can continue going down. You'll see some Pokemon like Deoxys Attack and Giratina Origin going 4 times. This surprised me a little bit just because there are Pokemon that typically don't unanimously go. They're actually very rare picks. Some Arceus forms. One thing I do want to point out here with the Dark, Ghost, and Steel Arceuses, besides Arceus Normal, these were the most frequent Arceus picks of the whole entire session for Cycle 1. And we'll notice this actually when looking at the Cycle 1 and 2 tiering comparisons. but this definitely did play a part into their tierings 100%, and I'll break that down a little bit more when we go over the board specifically. Kyurem Black was another Pokemon that actually kind of shocked me, only going in 3 tiers. I thought Kyurem Black was a fairly unique case considering the fact that it's physical ice type, which was really useful, on top of also the fact that Kyurem Black has some pretty good coverage for waters, which would be a typical ice resist, or even just running free shot this generation. Albeit at the same time though, there's a lot more dragon competition, so a lot of dragons did actually skew a bit lower because of this. I'm still surprised by Raid nonetheless, not going unanimous, but I can kind of get Kyurem Black. I just didn't think it would go only half the drafts. We can continue going down. You can see the next Arceus form being Arceus Fairy getting drafted twice. We continue going through. There's nothing too surprising in this range, I'll be honest. A lot of these mons were definitely more debatably picked. Albeit Mega Blaziken only going twice was a little bit surprising, but nothing too out there. We can keep going down, of course, and we see some more Arceus forms, being Arceus Ground, which got drafted a single time, but still, obviously, you know, getting drafted at least once means that it probably wasn't super out there tiering-wise. We can go through. We have a bunch of Arceus forms that didn't go. This does have some mons that outright aren't even on the dock. For example, Arcanine Hisuian. This is just future-proofing the dock for future seasons. But we do have some other things as well that were kind of surprising. The one that I do actually want to point out here, which is all the way really, really low on this list, was Necrozma Dawnwings, which actually went in 0 drafts. Now, Necrozma Dawnwings, I'm not going to act like I expected it to go in like 5 or 6 drafts, but I did expect a couple of teams to at least grab this Pokemon. So this was something that definitely did actually surprise me looking at the results. I believe also Giratina Regular, if I control for that. Giratina Regular, if I remember correctly, did end up actually only going in a few drafts. Yeah, Giratina Regular only went in 3 drafts. That was another one that kind of surprised me. I think this one would be a lot better in the completely unrestricted format. So as we see, looking at this first board here, we do have obviously these first mons, but how do they end up actually changing when going through? Comparing this to Cycle 2, we do have a lot of things that end up actually changing. For one, we do have the new point cap at 45 points, with Mega Ray and Celestian Crown being unanimous first and second picks in every single division, besides one where Mega Ray actually went 4th. These were pretty clear-cut stories. We also noticed that everything in 35 actually did raise to 40 points. They ended up going with the max value. We set the ranges to 3 to 5 points for any single raise and 2 to 4 for any single drop. This was that way then stuff could end up rising, but never ended up just outright plummeting. For example, with the Dawnwings, otherwise, if this just never got drafted, that mine might have ended up even hitting as low as like maybe 9 points or even just 1 point. I don't know how the specific math would work, but it would have went a lot lower than it ended up going. And this way, then, we can actually control to a certain degree what happens, because otherwise we're just drafting and throwing, and it's just shooting fish in a barrel until we end up actually hitting something that we like. So with this in mind as well, some other things that were very interesting was Mega Gengar Rising. Now, for anyone who's been a very, very big BBL veteran, you know that I shit on this Pokemon a lot in the BBL format that we had previously, when this would have been a solo Uber, but I'm actually kind of surprised this only went to 31. I kind of did expect it to go to 32 with Mewtwo and Ultra Necrozma, considering the fact that Mega Gengar in a format like this is a lot more just viable, considering the fact that you have other Ubers to support this and actually carry a team, and the trapping for something like, let's say, a Zygarde Complete versus a Garchomp is a whole different playing field. Now, obviously, I just compare those because they're very type linear, they're very different Pokemon to begin with, but even if we're looking at something more comparable, trapping for something like a Primal Groudon or even a regular Groudon is a huge difference from trapping for something like a Garchomp, so, or even like a later T. One of the other things we did notice rose, though, and pretty incredibly, was Ho-Oh and Groudon. These mons both ended up raising as high as 30 points, which was honestly a huge fucking increase for both of these. They were both pretty early picks, though, both going pretty unanimously round 1 and round 2. Lunala also rose to 30, and same as Zekrom. All Pokemon that, honestly, I can kind of get Lunala and Zekrom rising, especially seeing that Ho-Oh and Groudon did. I'm just a little shocked that Groudon also rose this high, especially when other Pokemon that we previously did tier similarly all ended up being in the 23 and 22 range, if not even lower. Some other pretty big standouts was Magearna rising to 29. This is a huge shock, but more so just considering the fact that some Pokemon lower than it ended up being actually miles better in my opinion. Stuff like, for example, Marshadow ended up only being 26 points, which this one did really surprise me. I'll be honest. As I said, I kind of know what Splinter's formula was, but I still don't, I cannot fathom how Marshadow ended up in 26 points. But regardless though, we'll see this carry over in next week's video on just how much this ended up actually mattering, because I do think this was one of those Pokemon that really did end up actually changing because of how much lower it sank. Which was only 2 points to be fair, but still. We see some other cases, of course, with stuff like Mega Lucario being 24 points. This ended up going down a little bit. Some more examples, Cinderace through Ashgren, all these Pokemon were 18 points previously, and now they're all 23 points. Same as Mega Kang, actually. Mega Kang going up kind of surprised me, because Mega Kang is a mon that I don't think has ever really went in BBL before maybe like a season or two. ever across the generations. But this was a Pokemon that was actually rather in high demand, actually, just considering the fact, if I had to guess, that you could pair it with a lot of other really good Ubers. Some more surprising things, though, if we get into our 20 category, we start to see the first traces of some of the non-Uber Pokemon previously. Stuff like Mega Diancie, Garchomp, and Mew, for example, to name a few. All these Pokemon ended up rising to 20, and this was actually a little bit surprising. At the same time, though, I'm not really surprised with these bottom two being Mega Scizor and Tornti. These were both pretty unanimous around 2 or 3 Pokemon. I think the latest that Tornti went was back end of round 3, and I think Mega Scizor went like a little bit early in round 4. But these were both pretty unanimously like very early pick Pokemon. Garchomp went late in a couple pools if I remember correctly, but overall though, this was again a Pokemon that went rather early. What more so surprised me though was again the Dragapult thing, and this is where I think the Dragapult only going 5 times did actually impact the fact that it rose to 19 instead of 20 points. Considering the fact that I do think that one extra draft might have actually pushed it to that same tier as Garchomp, which it really just goes to show the frequency thing does kind of matter, and that's why we're doing 6 drafts at once instead of just 1, because we only did 1 case. It's literally an all or nothing at that point, and it's a lot less indicative of a month's actual value. But averaging 6 total drafts together, though, does make a bit of a difference. Some other really funny things, though, Clefable, Glowking, Finny, etc., all being an 18, but I think the funniest tier really just goes down to the 16 and 15 range, specifically the 16 range. That is some Pokemon such as Kyurem Black, Mega Alakazam, Deoxys Normal, in the same tier as stuff like the Nidos, Mamoswine, and Zarude, which more so just goes to show how not sought after these Pokemon were. In general, a lot of the things that ended up really benefiting just from this sort of usage base, because stuff like Crocodile is typically a pretty desirable ground type in terms of the standard draft format, considering the fact that its typing is amazing and it has the ability to intimidate, as well as really malleable stats in any sort of match. So I definitely do think this kind of reflected in Crocodile raising. Same as stuff like Zarude, which especially gets exponentially better when you have to fight 2 different Kyogres potentially. And this mod is one of the better non-Uber checks to it. If we keep going down the list, I'm not going to go over every tier, obviously. But some very interesting stuff, of course, was 14 points. Having stuff like Blissey in the same tier as Mega Medicham and Latios was just really funny to me. If we keep going through the board, of course, there's a lot of stuff I could really pick and choose. But probably one of my favorites, if I had to say, would probably be looking at the 10 to 12 point range. And this one I did think definitely had a lot of Pokemon that actually ended up being rather steals going into this. And that'll play a part, obviously, looking at the future board. Actually, it's probably the 10 to 9 range I think is a better indication. But for example, we look in the 12 point range, we see stuff like Infernape here, for example. We also see some Pokemon such as Mega Slowbro, Zapdos, Galar. All of these are pretty good Pokemon in this tier, and they tier in the same range as other Pokemon that are a little less desirable, stuff like maybe Blacephalon, Mega Aerodactyl, and other Pokemon of the sort. But it's more so when comparing this to the 11 point range, etc. We see stuff like Bulu, which ends up now having a 7 point difference from Rillaboom, which should actually help make Bulu a lot more of a justifiable pick, albeit maybe not to that same degree, hopefully by the end of this, but even just a few point difference, as I said, this should help Bulu potentially be a lot more desirable of a pick. We also see some Pokemon like Galadarm ended up going down to 11 points, which I'll be honest, I don't really get this one. I know that Galadarm is obviously a fairly overhyped Pokemon, but just the fact that it is a pretty good Scarf in this sort of format, I did kind of expect it to go down to like maybe 12, but 11 was a little bit steep in my opinion. We also see some stuff like Hippowdon in 10, Metagross in 10, Salamence regular in 10. All these Pokemon that definitely ended up going a bit lower than I would have anticipated, but Salamence, to its credit, was mostly just due to the Dragon hype. But overall, though, I think that generally this board ended up reflecting a lot about what actually, for the most part, is actually drafted or not. Albeit some stuff will inherently end up going up or down as the board progresses. But I do want to end this off going over a couple of really big highlight drafts from this. Now, I'm not going to go over every single team and every single pool, but I do want to go over a couple that I do think actually were really good. For one, we do have the Drapion duplicate team being clutch sometimes as team in Pool 10. This is, in my opinion, the best Xerneas draft by a good margin, consisting of Xerneas, Mega Metagross, Garchomp, Suicune, Ash Greninja, Tangrowth, Blaziken, Drapion, Crobat, and Regirock. Now, looking through this, Drapion, of course, was round 8 pick, so actually Clutch was the one who did pick it up first. M-Dragon was the one who would have needed to replace it. But overall, though, I will say that I think that Clutch's team was definitely one of the best Xerneas drafts, and overall one of the better ones in this. I'm not going to really go over any of my drafts. I don't really want to, like, inflate my ego about it, but I know a couple people really seem to like my Arceus draft here with Arceus Normal, with Mega Gengar. This team right here. I thought it was pretty good, albeit I do think this is also my weakest team. I miss a couple of key things on paper, at least. Stuff like, for example, good Fairy for Dragons. I have some good counterplays, stuff like Scarf Ray, which outpaces a good amount. Metagross is a good steal, at least spin-F-wise. And then, like, again, like the Galadarm that I was really hyping up earlier. That's a little bit of why. My Fairy is literally Clefairy, which doesn't really check a lot of stuff, to be fair. It's more so for the non-Uber Dragons. But overall, though, This pool didn't really have anything to stand out. I did want to point out those couple teams though. The other one being M-Dragon's team with the second Drapion, of course. Both the Drapion teams would really stand out in this pool. This one also had a duplicate Vikavolt pick, if I remember correctly, but I forget who actually doubled up on that. I think it was Burgo, though. But M-Dragon's team had a really good Arceus Fairy draft with Kieran Black, and I do think this is a really good case of why Kieran Black probably should have went in more pools, considering Kieran Black being such a cheap dragon, while still being a really good Dragonite abuser, and able to actually handle a lot of the format, considering it's faster than most of the Dragon Dance users. I do think it's pretty good in its favor, if nothing else. Especially the fact that this is also a really good Scarf one, which at the very least stuff like Mega Ments, which would naturally outpace, can't really do. It's really only Mega Ray that can actually legitimately do it while still being a good Dragon Dance user. Going into 1B, we have one of the best drafts, I think, of this whole session being Lucas B's team. Which Lucas B ended up getting a team of Arceus Ground, Ho-Oh, Zekrom, Mega Scizor, Slowbro, Nidoking, Mandibuzz, Aegislash, Crustle, and Marini. Now, I do think that Lucas definitely got not only the best Arceus team in this whole session, but I also just think probably if I had to name a team, either the very best or the second best team. And I'll get into the one that I think kind of gives it a bit of a contest later on. It'll actually be the next team I go over. But Lucas's team did a really good job, I think, of really defensively pairing. Obviously, Ho-Oh is a really good Pokemon in general with Regen, and Arceus Ground being able to switch into Rock types for it is amazing. Ho-Oh is also a really good check to grounds defensively, at least to a certain degree, while as Arceus Ground also can definitely check a few of them, such as Primal Ground, which is great for the Zekrom synergy. Obviously, Scizor is really good for Xerneas checking, which could have potentially set up and run a mix set with like Moonblast plus Rock Slide and tore this team apart. So Mega Scizor being here is really amazing for that. Overall, Lucas definitely seemed to really know what Pokemon were really good at actually checking stuff versus just pseudo-checking them. What I mean by this, of course, is, for example, if you look at a team like my team here, for example, I have my switches Kyogre are Toxapex and Serperior, and that is purely just for the Water Stab. Neither of those actually really threaten Kyogre from just clicking like a Calm Mind Water Spout Thunder set, or even just clicking a Scarf Water Spout set, since Pex at best can just be passive against it and just switch in and out and just consistently take it until it runs out of PP. Which is something at least, but if Pex ever got predicted on a Specs hit, it's dropping to Thunder outright, and then I'm kind of fucked. And on the flip side as well, comparing some other sort of teams, like for example, if we look at, I'll be honest, it's kind of hard to name another one offhand. I just remember mine because it's the one I drafted. I know my team's weaknesses with it. But overall, though, I think Lucas definitely did a good job at actually drafting things that will actually check the mons they're supposed to check. Looking at C, there wasn't anything too sad out here, but I gotta give credit to HGC, of course. Another team that I think did a really good job at drafting some good value. For example, Mega Gyarados at 14, very last round too. Really good offensive option in this format, especially having the dual dark here, allowing Muck to be the more defensive option against Ghosts and Psychics for this team, which is really useful, especially in the Ghost end for Ultra Narcosma and the Psychic end for Zamazenta. And Mega Gyarados could also just take advantage of and set up on teams. Alone Muck also gives the T-Spike immunity, so definitely has some different usage from Gyarados, which would otherwise just maybe set up and win. Muck can definitely be more of an actual utility piece here, so I did like this team a lot. There's some other good ones like M-Dragon. M-Dragon's team is pretty good with Zacian and Naga. I think this is another team that definitely took advantage of not necessarily just trying to top heavy the team, but still getting some really good options to pair with Zacian. For example, obviously Naga and Nidoking are both really good options for Naga specifically. Able to just be a really good spike user for this team, and Nidoking a good rock one. So giving good housing support while Naga's also a really good backup breaker, and just good pivot as well for the team. Mega Metagross obviously being pretty good against most fairies that might just want to oppose the team, which is great considering the fact that this is really the only fairies besides Nidoking in the team. We also have stuff like, for example, Nidoking being a really good steel killer for Zacian, which is really good so that you don't have to drop the defense with close combat, which is really useful. I can go on and on, but overall, that was probably one of the good teams. Now, I did end up talking about these two teams a bit, but the one that I did actually mention that did give Luce's team a bit of a run for its money was T-Rich's team, the 4th pick Mega Ray team. As I said, I would go over this a little bit later, but Mega Ray ended up being a really good standout pick here, in my opinion, being 4th pick. I do think, objectively speaking, Zacian Crowd, in my opinion, was the best first pick. Mega Ray would have been in the top 5, but I think I might have eaten my words a little bit here just seeing Rich's team. Rich's did a phenomenal job, actually, of drafting around Mega Ray, in my opinion. Getting Sylvie Solgaleo Pex to cover the Xerneas matchup, which is a little bit scary for it, especially if it's defensive, as well as the Arceus Fairy one. Not only this, but Urshifu Single is just a really good backup breaker, maybe making sure that Ray can click more moves like Dragon Set and Outrage, or even just clicking Dragon Claw, or even Draco. Whereas normally it would have to be a little bit cautious of it by clicking moves like V-Create or Earthquake to handle steals. Urshifu's an amazing steel killer in that regard. Also really good at killing Psychics, which at the very least, while they wouldn't necessarily like really damn this team, they're at least to a degree a little bit annoying for something like Solgaleo and Pex. But obviously, I mean, Pex can just switch out and get some HP back on the turn that it does, and then Urshifu could take advantage of them that way. Landorus as well is a really good backup steel killer for this team, and especially the ice weakness, stuff like Solgaleo Pex really patches that. So having 2 mons that are 4 times weak to ice, and I say that obviously knowing that Mega Ray does a Delta Stream, which does get around that weakness, is really good. And this is another team where, again, I think that Kyurem Black ended up being really damning for a lot of teams, because most teams are going to struggle switching on a Mega Ray as it is, let alone having to deal with another Dragon in Kyurem Black. Most teams just will not have counterplay to handle that, in my opinion. And especially when you compare it to stuff like Solgaleo as a really, really consistent parry check, that second Dragon type really is not going to be a big deal for this team. Going over in the 2B, there wasn't really anything I thought that really stood out here. I think all the teams are just kind of fine here. But if I had to pick a best team in this pool, I would probably give it to T-Ridges again. T-Ridges, the turn of this Ho-Oh team, I think is just a really filthy core, especially getting round 3 Lunala with that. But another team that I think did a really good job in this pool, in my opinion, was B-Town's team. Now, there are definitely a few issues with this team, in my opinion. For example, Clefable, I do think is a little bit lackluster of a fairy type. However, at the same time, having stuff like Celesteal as a backup check for Dragons, I think should at least help a little bit there. And especially when you also have Pex, which you can at least switch in on stuff like Reshiram, which would otherwise massacre that core. This team definitely doesn't worry about Zekrom, but in a vacuum at least, for this specific 16, B-Town has it. So again, really good job at preparing around knowing what the team's weaknesses are here. Kang was a really good sleeper mega. Again, really went pretty early. I think this is one of the latest Kang picks, if not maybe around 7 in the entire set, if I remember correctly. I do think this team's a little bit setup reliant, but I think it's a team that, again, could be really impressive, and really any Mon here I think is actually a very amazing pick, depending on the matchup. It's not like shoehorning in a 1 or 2 point punch to have it for maybe one specific Pokemon. I think realistically, if you just needed a Ghost check, Kecleon can do it. Just stuff like that. So, again, not the greatest team, but I do think for the pool, this is one of the better teams in my opinion. Feel free to disagree. Another team, of course, I think was really good was Corey's team, getting Kyogre Rain, especially without having to rely on a Rain Sweeper. Barrascuda still is a pretty good pivot, at least without speed tier, and Torrentee is able to abuse Hurricanes. Zeraora, Never Missing Thunder, as well as Deoxys Attack for that matter, which is a pretty good coverage option on it in general. So I did like this team a lot. Finally though, 1C. Again, not really any huge standout teams here, though I do want to mention that Rich has got another Mega Ray team, and I think this one was infinitely worse. Rich, just feel free to disagree. I definitely do stand by that, though. I think that realistically this team fell off a lot once you start getting into the Slowbro Galar Regieleki Swanna range. And I know it's only like 17 points of the team, but in terms of like 3 whole Pokemon you're kind of just throwing on here for the fuck of it, I didn't really think Slowbro Galar offered a lot outside of a fighting check, which you already have some pretty good ones at the very least. Mega Ray could offensively handle, and Coco can as well. Buzz was a pretty good switch in. I would have probably just gotten a little bit of a bulky ghost here. Even something like Coffagrigus I think was around at this point, which, yeah, it was around at this point. So I probably would have done that in my personal opinion, but still not a bad team. Zeke's team was pretty good, though I will say I'm not huge in the Emolga pick, and I know it's like, again, a 1-point Pokemon, but there was some pretty good stuff in that range. Megazord YLs I think was a little bit annoying here for this team, just considering the fact of how few defoggers are consistent on this draft. But again, not the worst option here. Zeke's team is still pretty good, offensively speaking, at least. But yeah, these are the teams. Obviously, again, I know I didn't cover every single draft here. Feel free to mention what teams you like the most if you were in or spectating a study, or if you want to just join the server and get involved, join the server down below. If you enjoyed the video though, leave a like and subscribe. I'll be back next week with another edition of this for the second rotation of the drafts. Hopefully you guys found this interesting and learned something new. With that said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, peace out, guys.